somewhere.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Providence, where we love beyond belief. Welcome to our service today, where we will continue to learn about our history and to celebrate the women of this congregation across 3 centuries. This is the day we have been given. May we make the very most of it. Please join me in saying the chalice lighting words found in your order of service. This light burns also in our hearts, and it lights our path towards harmony, justice, and hope for all. This is our time for greeting one another, so I'd love to invite everyone to stand up and from your places, look around the meeting house, check out the folks that you know, make some new friends from a little bit of a distance. Everybody, make your greetings known to your neighbors and friends in the congregation. Thank you. And now, after we get a chance to do that for a moment, we're going to turn around and face the camera, which is in the back corner. Michael's waving. So everyone join me in a big wave to the folks who are joining us from home. Last week, Liz told us that about 100 people or more are known to be on the line, or on this streaming broadcast of our service today. So make sure that they all know that we say hi. It's such a pleasure to be connected in this way. As I mentioned earlier, today we continue the celebration of our 300-year history with a focus on learning about the women who have contributed so much to our congregation and community. Our guide today is Phyllis Cole, who joined First U about 4 years ago. She's a scholar of women's studies and religion, and using her expertise, she has mined many archives to find the stories she will tell us today. She's going to start by introducing us to a few of her heroines.
Good morning. Good morning. We've just greeted each other here in this meeting house. Now I'd like to introduce you to some of the women who sat in literally these pews in times past. We have a guide to them through one woman's amazing power of memory. Sarah Wilkinson Burley lived for 101 years, all within the community of this church. And at the age of 90, in 1941, she told her story, probably to the Women's Alliance. It amounts to a guided tour of the meeting house. She was a trained artist, and her memories give us pictures. For instance, she recalled Dr. Hall sending off our boys in blue to the Civil War. That's the part of her talk most often quoted. But the rest of it primarily tells who is who for decades after the Civil War, even where they sat. In those years, the pews were officially leased to families, and while she describes these families, she gravitates toward the women in each one. Most amazingly, since we also have the original map of pew ownership, we can actually find at least some of those families and their women members. Sarah's own Wilkinson grandfather had a pew on the south side of the main aisle. Sarah would have sat in the 10th row as a child. And there she is now. Hello, Sarah. But especially, she tells us of two aunts who were the last official dwellers in this family pew. One of them was Mrs. Mary R. Tibbetts, who headed the church's sanitary commission during the Civil War. Every day of the week, she says, for 4 years. As part of a large-scale project across the north, she took over the chapel of the Sunday school, mobilizing women and children to make bandages for soldiers. Sarah's own mother was among the workers, as well as the girl herself. There's also some comedy in what Sarah remembered. She was always interested in watching the Watson family's fashionable daughters engineer their big hoop skirts through the narrow doorway of their pew and settle themselves in their seats. I figure those skirts must have been 5 feet wide. The Watsons sat in row 28 on the north side, ahead of the Wilkinsons, but still nearby. So imagine both the Watson daughters' engineering and young Sarah's curiosity from across the aisle. All in all, Sarah lays out a profile of this community, including its work in the church and the larger world. I'll have to settle for just a few of the women she names. In the front pew on the north side were the Bowen family. He was the governor of the state, and his wife thoroughly interested in everything at church. A generation later, their daughter Edna served on the committee to revise the church covenant, as well as headed the Lincoln School. A very few of these women had careers and official church leadership roles, but many more, like Mrs. Bowen, found a calling as lay women here. Sarah, herself a Sunday school teacher for decades, gives us word portraits of colleagues in this work. Julia Bullock had gray curls held in place by side combs on each side of her cheeks. Carolyn Bowen had a placid face, blue eyes, and fair hair, like a painting by one of the old masters. So does Sarah tell us of leaders in the Women's Alliance, to which she always belonged after it was founded. Maud Donnell was the president for several years, and Sally Randolph, its first secretary. Seated in the front pew of the North Gallery, up there with her sisters. They were all brilliant women, Sarah concluded. Indeed, Sarah held up the virtue and accomplishment of these women as a whole. Julia Draper, daughter of a deacon, was like him, devoted to good works. Just north of the pulpit, in the side-to-side pews, where Janice Akumian is right now, which she called the Amen Row, was the Metcalf family. Susie had a very beautiful voice and was a contralto singer in the choir. But Matilda Metcalf perhaps summed up all these gifts. Beyond Civil War service, or brilliance, or good works, or great singing, Matilda's life and soul were bound up in the church, constantly thinking of it and working for it. These are some of our church ancestors, Sarah declared in 1941. Let us leave as good a record, and we will.
Good morning. I'm Janice Okumian, and together with Jeff Allard, our music director, and Chris Sanzo, our accompanist, we have put together some music that we think goes with the theme of this morning's service. Emily Dickinson is the poet whose work is most often set to music by composers. And I will be singing two different composers' settings of two different of her poems this morning. And my daughter Phoebe is going to be singing the postlude, which is not Emily Dickinson. It is a song from the Disney film Moana about a Polynesian girl and leader, and with music written by Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Good morning, everyone. This is this week's joys and sorrows as they were shared in person in this book or through email online. We do have a couple of happy ones. We have a candle of gratitude from Suzanne Alden, who writes, "Thank you to all my First U friends for the outpouring of support while my son David was in the Hasbro Children's Hospital with pneumonia. Your love and care made a difficult time so much easier." We also have something of a joy that Janet Downing Taylor is back online. She has recovered mostly from her concussion and is ready to hear from us all. And for the candles that follow, friends, cards are welcome. You can find addresses in the church directory, which is in the church office. There are several this day. A candle of healing for Jude Saunders as she recovers from a major surgery. A candle of recovery for Greg Cole as he leaves the hospital to go into rehab. A candle of healing for Dave Lewis as he recovers from back surgery. A candle of health and peace for Mary Kohler as she navigates the continued pain from cancer. A candle of wellness for Craig Woods as he recovers from illness and exhaustion. A candle of health and our continued prayers for Graham Nye. A candle for a quick recovery for our own Empress, Mary Frappier, as she manages a foot fracture. A candle of hope for Lisa, hoping her procedure goes well. A candle in loving memory of Beth Ann Turney, a prominent woman in our congregation in the early 21st century due to her great intelligence and bottomless well of kindness and generosity. The Girl Effect sale that is happening today, in fact, was in part founded by Beth Ann Turney. Shop a lot, as they say. Two candles from Tom Getz. On Monday night, my cousin James continues his journey in the next experience after death. A talented man who was a joy to be with, this first candle is lit for his wife and his son and our great Hawaiian memories and, of course, Woodstock. Let their grief be lifted in the memory of their drive through life with Captain James. A second candle is lit for James's sister Bev, who had a stroke on Monday, yes, the same Monday. Let her recovery be quick and her health fully restored. A candle of deep sympathy for the sudden death of my friend and executive producer of the Boston Gay Men's Chorus, Bill Casey. His large and gregarious talent will be hugely missed. And lastly, a candle of grief and sympathy for my brother Robert Peltier for the unexpected death of his eldest son, Bobby, just this weekend. Let us prepare our minds and hearts for meditation and prayer. I'm going to share the words of Shelley Jackson Denham, and we will share some silence, at which time you're welcome to stand or raise your hand if you want to pay tribute to someone you've lost this year. To begin, let's relax. Let your shoulders drop. Let your bodies relax. Feel yourself in your seats. Please take a deep breath with me. And again. And one more. Dark of winter, soft and still, let your quiet calm surround me. Let my thoughts go where they will, ease my mind profoundly, and then my soul will sing a song, a blessed song of love eternal. Gentle darkness, soft and still, bring your quiet to me. Darkness, soothe my weary eyes that I may see more clearly. When my heart with sorrow cries, comfort and caress me. And then my soul may hear a voice, a still small voice of love eternal. Darkness, when my fears arise, let your peace flow through me. The peace of love eternal. Amen.
The sun has come out, have you noticed? Sarah Burley's walk through the meeting house offers a wonderfully live starting point on women and our history. Of course, it wasn't until recent decades that women have led this congregation as ordained ministers. But my story has more to do with women in the pews, these very pews, which haven't moved at all in 200 years. Members like Sarah and the others she recalled. I want to touch on all 3 centuries of our church's life in Providence with just a few characters and events from each. Let's call this the beginning of a new portrait gallery of our women. But the big picture first. Church histories often tell about the leadership of ministers, but even more, as Reverend Liz has been saying, this church is a beloved community of lay people across generations who pledge their commitment to walk together by signing a covenant of shared belief. Sarah called the church she had been born into Dr. Hall's church, referring to Edward Brooks Hall in his 34 years here. But who signed the covenant book as members of this church? 350 people joined over those years that Hall was here. 75 of them were men and 275 women. Wow, that's a ratio of almost 4 women for every man. Men did invest in the pews. The earlier map of who leased which seat shows over 100 of them, and only 4 women, necessarily women who were either single or widowed, since married women could not by law claim any property as their own. There was almost a division of labor. Men acted on their financial and professional status to represent their families at church, and women actually joined, quite often apart from their husbands. As one historian puts it, men owned the pews, but women owned the covenant. Actually, in the beginning, women couldn't become members. In 1728, 9 men alone signed the first covenant, as was standard practice for the Boston Calvinist churches from which we came. This was part of their belief in the fallenness of humanity. As Increase Mather put it, Eve had been created after Adam, and she had sinned before Adam, so she was doubly fallen. Only men could be constituent members of the church, holding the keys to the kingdom of heaven. But our congregation soon began its path toward more liberal theology by disclaiming this idea of original sin. Women as well as men signed the next covenant in 1761. Not that the record shows anything more of them as a result. But women always, naturally, had voices and opinions, and occasionally their words survive. At the time of the Revolution, our not yet ordained minister Enos Hitchcock left his bride Aksa in Providence while he went off to serve as a chaplain in the army. And her letters to him give a running account of the woefully inadequate supply preachers the church had to put up with. A man from Dedham arrived, his hair stiff with powder and pomatum, acting like a beau come courting. Aksa concluded, "I cannot bear him, and that is all I will say about him." She felt quite free to judge the male clergy, at least in private. But Aksa Hitchcock shows up on a more official record 18 years later, and that moment is key to our larger story. In 1800, she joined 66 other Providence women across denomination in signing her name to found the Providence Female Charitable Society. The ideas of her husband Enos may have helped lead to such a venture. A decade before, he had written a novel, Memoirs of the Bloomsgrove Family, arguing that female character was key to the American future. Not that women should act outside their families, but they might teach their children so as to expand for all society and what he called the benevolent affections. Benevolence, wishing for and acting upon goodness, was both the prime quality of God and the center of human morality. Such a principle made Enos Hitchcock attack the institution of slavery in this same book. And it cracked open the door for women as he portrayed a mother and children helping the poor in their neighborhood. But soon his wife did much more, co-founding a city-wide society led by women and serving the poor on a large scale. Aksa was moving into the new 19th century. She died just 2 years later, but her neighbor and co-signer of this charter, Elizabeth Nightingale, served for 30 more years as a leader of the Providence organization, as well as first president in 1815 of a separate female benevolent society in this church. It's Elizabeth whom I'd like to present especially as a woman in our church, again in these pews, as it reached the end of its first 100 years. She claimed her place in the meeting house on the basis of values expressed here, but acted upon in the larger world. The records of her citywide group reveal a highly structured enterprise, modeled more on men's businesses than women's households. Twice a month, so-called managers reported to the society's directresses on cases of need they had located and supported. Elizabeth started out as a manager, but most of the years from 1805 to 1830, she was the leading directress, while also first president of the Female Benevolent Society here at our church. Meanwhile, the life of this pioneer of charity in Providence, I find, was personally complex and shadowed by loss. As wife of Joseph Nightingale, Elizabeth was among the wealthiest women in Providence. The cover of our bulletin shows their mansion as a close neighbor to Enos Hitchcock's first church, the church in the background, the picture you see there. Both of them built in the 1790s. Elizabeth, but not Joseph, was a member and the donor of 3 silver communion goblets that we still own. But the Nightingale's wealth came from Joseph's career as a distiller of rum, part of the triangle trade with sugar production and capture of Africans into slavery. I try to imagine the conversation between the Hitchcocks and the Nightingales on slavery. Yet the church hardly refused her silver, let alone her leadership in alleviating the economic inequalities of this city. But add to this the sad irony that she began her career of charity 3 years after Joseph suddenly died, soon followed by the son who might have supported her after losing his fortune in a disastrous slaving voyage. Women lacked economic power in fundamental ways. Elizabeth soon lost the Yellow Mansion, and at her death in 1837, the newspaper declared her insolvent, with lawyers auctioning off the remains of her furniture and china to start paying off a large burden of debts. Elizabeth died in genteel poverty compared with the people whose lives she had supported. But what tragedy is mixed with her success? Neither the law nor personal knowledge made her a successful directress of her own money. Still, she was a major innovator from our church, the beginning point for a new era of benevolent labor by women. Our second 100 years, from 1820 to 1920, embraced huge changes for both church and nation, from the founding of Unitarianism through years just after World War I. For women, that century brought property rights, educational opportunity, and finally the right to vote. Sarah Burley was born into it, and this was the world she recalled from the end of her life. I'll recall just a few parts of this picture. Sunday school was the new bedrock form of women's service in the church. Sarah grew up in it and then taught others. This program aimed to promote the good of society, as the teachers wrote in a collective history, with the lesson that God was to be loved and not feared, with Jesus their leader and conscience their guide. As one teacher recalled, they were always trying to recruit men to teach, but we managed to live and thrive without them. The program began at First Church in 1821, the same year Unitarianism began, and one of its first half dozen trial efforts at religious education. The place was a cold and dreary room, so-called cold and dreary room in the vestry, in other words, the basement of the meeting house, down those stairs, the only place for group meetings. From the start, it had two purposes: not only to teach a newly affirming faith to children of the congregation, but also to instruct the poor in literacy as well as morality. The second part was more controversial, but developed into a ministry at large that Dr. Hall led in the 1840s, with its own associate minister and a chapel on working class Olney Street. But the church also expanded on its own ground. After a petition by those women Sunday school teachers, a chapel was built behind the church in 1840, then rebuilt as a massive granite structure in 1877. Through various upgrades, it would become our present-day parish hall, a center for lay teaching and activity. Projects of the Female Benevolent Society overlapped with the Sunday school. They contributed 800 books to a library in its chapel, but it was an active scene of work as well as study. Recall Sarah's aunt, Mary Tibbetts, who mobilized women and children in that room to make bandages during the Civil War. But more radical possibilities had already grown up from the Benevolent Society as well. In 1837, the same year its founder Elizabeth Nightingale died, this group of women from First Church published a written call for women across denomination to meet again in our vestry to start a new organization. The leader this time was not an aging lady, but a young, hard-working mother named Harriet Ware Hall, wife of Dr. Hall. She is our strongest woman's voice of these years, though unexpectedly she too died by the end of 1837. Her co-founders at First Church, as well as colleagues from other churches, continued the Providence Employment Society for decades after. This was not a charity, but an active effort to change what their pamphlet called out as the social evil and actual injustice of Providence capitalism. They set up a workshop and a store to set fair wages and prices, as well as founding schools, as many as 5 around the city, to teach sewing and reading. And they recorded notes and statistics on their accomplishments in annual reports. One woman commented that real people lay behind these numbers, their histories known at least partially by, quote, those of us who watch the lives of individuals or families through a series of years. This was deeply personal work. At the end of their first difficult year, the report noted with satisfaction that at least we have done something. Doing something despite the obstacles has always been key to this church's good works, our social justice efforts, then and now. Yet another new departure, as they called it, came in 1882, the Women's Alliance. Here we have 2 direct witnesses. Its first president, Adeline Slicer, who shared her memories with the Alliance 30 years later, and Secretary Sally Randolph. Remember her? She was the woman Sarah Burley recalled sitting up there in the gallery with her sisters, all brilliant women. At the urging of denominational leaders in Boston, at first there was a women's auxiliary taking on oversight of all charitable work from previous times, as well as supporting the denomination as a whole. But Adeline Slicer recalled that battles followed. Here in Providence, the old Benevolent Society members were by now elderly, devoted to sewing for the poor, and they hotly opposed a new organization of radicals managing their work. Meanwhile, some denominational leaders also feared that new women's initiatives would loot their treasury, as Adeline put it, by siphoning off money previously sent to Boston. After finally convincing Boston of their good intent, says Slicer, they asked each other, why should we be auxiliary? And declared themselves an independent alliance in both finances and programs. Up until the present decade, the Women's Alliance has been financially independent, even of our own church governance. What the Alliance did in the 1880s was reported in detail by brilliant Sally Randolph. Supporting Unitarianism in the Western U.S., they took part in a so-called post office project, where literature and letters went out in response to inquiries from Minnesota to Colorado. For instance, from a cattle rancher near Denver who asked, what is it Unitarians actually believe? But on the local level, new discussion and introspection arose to fit what Sally called an age of inquiry like the present. They felt a need to deepen the inner life while we stretch out. They discussed the value of reasonable religion, the importance of finding time in the day for quiet thought. A visiting lecturer spoke on the modern woman and the modern exigencies. I haven't seen that they discussed the current women's rights movement, but they definitely identified with women's higher education. Among those signing a 1906 petition for incorporation of the Alliance was Sarah Doyle, a strong member of this group, instrumental in founding both the Rhode Island School of Design and Pembroke, the Women's College of Brown. Today, Brown's Center for Women and Gender is named for her. She was definitely an active supporter of suffrage. Whether or not the Alliance organized around the question of political rights, it surely made room for members who did. Sarah Doyle should certainly join our gallery of those who worked from this church to make changes for women in the larger world. Our third century, since 1920, finally saw women rise to leadership in the church itself. This was by no means immediate. The first woman president of the congregation, Helen Calder Robertson, was elected in 1952. Among many kinds of service, she was a dedicated historian of the church, modestly mentioning her inaugural presidency in one account. Interestingly, it took another 20 years until 1972 for Mary Philbrook to be named the first woman deacon. A later writer commented that this office had always been for members of high moral character, offering leadership models for the congregation. So it seemed mystifying that somehow such representatives of rectitude always happened to be male. By then, 21 out of 32 recent deacons had actually been women. Recall Julia Draper, as Sarah Burley described her, like her father, Deacon Draper, devoted to good works. Finally, that devotion could be acted upon directly. Meanwhile, moral character also turned to social action both within and out from the church. Obviously, I can't give a complete history of this surge. Recommitment came especially in the 60s, the civil rights era, in the latter part of Robert Schoch's ministry. Old benevolence was rekindled in new social causes. We have remarkable access to facts and feelings from that time in the memory of present-day members. Sandy Schoch is a direct pipeline to his father's ministry. Are you back there, Sandy? Quoting Reverend Schoch's conviction that it was made possible only through the work of women. Helen Robertson, that first female president, was one of them, and Arlene Kiven, another, a strong voice for social justice. Then Sandy introduced me to Kate Bowden as the third generation in her family line of women activists, from grandmother Arlene Kiven to mother Ruth Ariana to herself. Kate tells me of what seems a perfect symbol of that legacy. Before her mother Ruth died in 2019, she bestowed upon Kate the gavel belonging to grandmother Arlene as president of the League of Women Voters. With Sandy and Kate as guides, let's drop into the 60s and the battle for fair housing in Providence. There was broad advocacy from this church for racial justice. Reverend Schacht preached against discrimination, and his family moved their parsonage to the black neighborhood of Congdon Street. His major source of inspiration and partnership in this battle was Arlene, who served in the state legislature as a representative of the Providence East Side and finally succeeded in the 1865 passage of fair housing legislation. Kate remembers that her grandmother's family was threatened with violence, including a possible bomb under their car, so her children were taken out of town one summer for their safety. Arlene's master's thesis at Brown on the history of the Negro in Rhode Island was immediately published by the Urban League, of which she was a member. But church bonds also remained strong. Later in life, she served as a term as president of the Women's Alliance. Arlene's daughter, Ruth Ariana, as many present will remember, worked primarily within the church and its own outreach. As one friend put it, serving in the food pantry was her spiritual practice. I love the way that description combines active work and inner spirit. Maybe it's the essence of benevolence translated into 21st century terms. A few more words about the food pantry. According to one of its founders, Ann Boyd, it was planned in 2000 by a social justice oversight committee that stood alongside an anti-racism committee and a world affairs committee. All of these suggest the range of our church's activism a couple of decades ago. Opening the food bank was possible only after reorganizing the church basement to store food for distribution. Remember that vestry? Its space now has yet another incarnation as a place of service, especially to the poor of this city. It has not been work for just women, but women have kept it going. In the past 20 years, leadership has passed on to Amy Grant and Judy Ortman, with Judy now establishing a partnership with the Refugee Dream Center to serve families newly arrived in this country. Our church and city are part of a larger world. Which brings me to my last example of activism by women, this time suitably, specifically for women. Girl Effect grew out of another recent project, which began in 2005 with a group reading a book on the world need to raise families out of poverty. Marilyn Ennett reports that Sarah Slate jumped on this idea saying, well, we need to do something. And they did. 4 years later came the new term, the new name, Girl Effect, and the specific mission to raise families out of poverty by educating their girls. Another lesson from our church's long commitment has been that educating the female half of the human race has direct and long-term impact. Girl Effect today is led by Polly Walker, and it supports school programs and specific scholarships for in rural Guatemala and more in urban Kenya. You will have the opportunity, in a sense, to meet these girls if you go out, I believe, in front of the church after the service and look at the committee's posters and handouts. With no holiday fare in this season, the Girl Effect project must go forward with a sales table outside the meeting house. It's both a goal for the present and a reflection of the church's long-held values. If Elizabeth Nightingale and Harriet Ware Hall and Sarah Slate were here, they would certainly support Girl Effect. They might even say, as the Providence Female Employment Society said in 1838, we have done something. Doing something is what we are about.
As Phyllis's remarks have just so ably demonstrated, we have been warmed by fires we did not build. We have drunk at wells we did not dig. We have been gathered in fellowship in this space that is far older than any of us assembled. But it is this space that we create and recreate anew that bonds us to each other. We pass our collection baskets to make a community expression of thanks for our many blessings, those we have witnessed and those yet to come. The morning's offering for the work of the congregation will now be generously given and gratefully received. We have the following invitations today to support and participate in various ways in the life of our congregation. First, we are excited that we'll be able to gather in person for Christmas Eve this year. There will be 2 services, one at 5 p.m. and one at 10 p.m. The first will have elements especially for children and families, and the second will have the traditional Christmas story and readings. Both services will include special music and candle lighting, and you'll want to come to the second service, the 10 o'clock service, a little bit early to hear extra music. After the second service, the deacons are hosting an outside reception with hot drinks, and there will be caroling. The choir will be singing at both services. Many protective protocols will be in place, but we wanted to make sure you know there will be people singing masked inside the meeting house. Because we still have COVID-19 protocols in place, we have to limit the attendance in the meeting house, and that means that everyone must make a reservation. I think Liz said something like, "This is no joke," last week, And it really is required that everyone call the church office and make a reservation if you plan to attend the service on Christmas Eve. Today after worship, out on the front lawn, the Girl Effect Task Force will be hosting its annual holiday fundraiser. Because of COVID restrictions, we're not able to hold the usual sale, but you can make a donation and take home a lovely thank you gift. The Girl Effect Task Force supports scholarships for girls' education in places where families often are not able to afford them, to send them to school beyond what we would call elementary school. We are currently supporting 4 girls in Guatemala, as well as supporting a school for girls in Kenya more generally. We hope you'll be able to continue that support. 100% of your donation will go directly to scholarships. If you don't have cash or a check today, you can follow the link in the latest edition of the First Few Times that we received by email on Friday to make a donation by mail. On Christmas Eve, we will also be celebrating the gift of children by reading the names of babies born in 2021 during the services. Children associated with First Few members and friends will be named. So if you'd like to have your little one named in the service, please send the name to Kathy by December 19th. Lastly, I'd like to invite you to join Connect and Reflect, which is an in-person fellowship held in the wood-paneled parlor immediately following the service. Today's facilitator is Louise Sloan, who's right there. Now let us go forth to enjoy the beauty of this day with gratitude for this beloved community and appreciation for the opportunities we've been given to find meaning and support and connect with one another. One more thing. Please join me in the chalice extinguishing words. We carry the flame of peace and love and hope until we meet again.
I've been staring at the edge of the water as long as I can remember, never really knowing why. I wish I could be the perfect daughter, but I come back to the water, no matter how hard I try. Every turn I take, every trail I track, every path I make, every road leads back to the place I know, where I cannot go, where I long to be. See the line where the sky meets the sea, it calls me, and no one knows how far it goes. If the wind in my sail on the sea stays behind me, if I go, there's just no telling how far I'll go. I know everybody on this island seems so happy on this island. Everything is by design. I know everybody on this island has a role on this island, so maybe I can roll with mine. With pride, I can make us strong. I'll be satisfied if I play along, but the voice inside sings a different song. What is wrong with me? See the light that shines on the sea, it's blinding, but no one knows how deep it goes. choice I make. Now I can't turn back from the great unknown, where I go alone, where I long to be. There's a line where the sky meets the sea, and it calls.